This video is made possible thanks to Olafly, offering unlimited data for your next trip in seconds. More on that in a moment. Okay, at this point, I think everyone knows that the United States has bombed Iran's nuclear program. Very few people expected it. Prior to Israel's attacks on Iran, Trump wanted to resolve the issues with the Islamic country through diplomacy. But it was precisely this intention to fix things by talking that led Israel to strike without any prior warning. That way, they forced Uncle Sam to choose a side and bomb Iran's nuclear program. In that sense, the move worked brilliantly for the Israeli state. However, we still don't know to what extent the bombings have actually been effective in halting Iran's nuclear program. In recent hours, many doubts have started to emerge.
Strike set back Iran's nuclear program by only a few months, U.S. report says. Preliminary classified findings indicate that the attack sealed off the entrances to 2 facilities, but did not collapse their underground buildings.
But okay, today we aren't here to talk about this attack, at least not directly. And there is one question that I'm certain, you have all asked yourselves over the last few days. Was Iran really about to get hold of the atomic bomb? This question is absolutely crucial. Among other reasons, because I'm sure you all remember the Iraq War. The US invaded the country, claiming it had weapons of mass destruction, weapons that were never found. And the truth is, Israel has been saying for years that Iran is just inches away, on the verge of acquiring nuclear weapons. Maybe this image rings a bell. Netanyahu trying to convince the UN that Iran's nuclear program was already 90% complete and just about ready to produce a bomb. This, VisualPolitik community, happened back in 2012. For his part, Trump is clear that yes, the Persians were already on the verge of their nuclear dream, but pay attention because his intelligence services don't share the same view.
What intelligence do you have that Iran is building a nuclear weapon? Your intelligence community has said they have no evidence that they are at this point.
Well, then my intelligence community is wrong. Who in the intelligence community said that?
Your director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard.
She's wrong.
Now then, after Trump publicly discredited his director of the National Intelligence Service, Tulsi Gabbard released a statement in which she came to say that the press had misinterpreted her words. According to her, it's true that there was no evidence Iran was building a nuclear weapon at an advanced stage, but there are many indications that, frankly, have no other explanation. Well, that's true. Just to give you one example, there's no other non-nuclear country in the world that has as much uranium enriched to 60% as the Ayatollah regime. And in case you're not familiar with this topic, let me remind you, uranium for nuclear power plants is enriched to around 4%, and anything above 20% is generally considered to have little civilian application. Its only real use, aside from 3 or 4 very specific fields, is to keep enriching it until it reaches over 90%, which is the level needed to build a nuclear bomb. But of course, having enriched uranium is one thing. Having a nuclear weapon is something completely different. The uranium from the centrifuges is in a gaseous state and must be converted into metallic form, which is not a simple process. After that, it needs to be fitted into a missile with a neutron detonator. And not just any missile, but one specifically designed for that task. So, here on VisualPolitik, we asked ourselves a couple of key questions. How much time would Iran really need to enrich uranium beyond 90%? And to have a fully functional nuclear missile? In short, how close was Iran really to having the bomb? That's exactly what we're going to break down in this video. Let's get started. Before we dive in, let's quickly talk about something that always comes up when traveling abroad. How do you get around? Find local spots, translate signs, or stay in touch with people back home without a reliable internet connection? Well, let's be honest, we all depend on our smartphones for all of that. But without the internet, your phone is basically just a camera with a clock. That's why staying connected is non-negotiable. At VisualPolitik, we've found the perfect solution: Olafly. No more overpriced roaming charges. Olafly gives you a simple, reliable way to stay online anywhere in the world. The secret? Their eSIM technology. No need to swap physical SIM cards or worry about losing your original one. Just install Olafly's eSIM and get unlimited data in over 200 destinations. No hunting for dodgy public Wi-Fi. No surprise charges. Just smooth, stable internet. And it's super easy. Head to Olafly's website or app and pick the plan that fits your trip. Install the eSIM instantly, either with a QR code or straight from the app. And that's it. You're online and ready to message family, book rides, or explore with zero stress. With Olafly's unlimited data eSIMs, staying connected while traveling has never been easier. Check the link in the description to get a 5% discount on any plan and destination with your next purchase. And now, back to our topic. To understand the state of Iran's nuclear program today, we first have to go back a bit in time to the 1990s. Iran was recovering from an extremely cruel war against Iraq, in which chemical weapons were the order of the day. Remember this detail because it will be important later. And naturally, what better way to avoid a similar conflict than to have a nuclear shield? If you add to this the fact that Iran is aiming for supremacy in the Middle East, and even for the annihilation of Israel, then the next objective was obvious: to get hold of nuclear weapons, no matter what. This is how the most ambitious plan of the Ayatollah's regime emerged: the Ahmad Plan. The Ahmad Plan emerged in the late 1990s and aimed to create a prototype nuclear missile by 2002. It was a comprehensive program that included all aspects of the development of the atomic bomb, from obtaining the enriched uranium to the explosion tests, through the implementation of the detonator, the computer simulations, the design of the rocket. In short, a plan to go from 0 to 100 in 3 or 4 years. Although there were delays right away, and the date for the long-awaited prototype jumped from 2002 to 2004. And naturally, we're talking about a completely secret project. If we know anything about it today, it's because the Mossad raided a bunker with lots of files on the subject in an operation straight out of Ocean's 11. By the way, inside these files, there were some red folders containing documents about all the cover stories that the Ayatollah regime used to present to the International Atomic Energy Agency. You know, according to Iran, its nuclear program has only ever had civilian purposes. But getting back to the Ahmad Plan, there are a lot of lessons we can learn here about how the Iranians operate. At first, the Iranians tried to purchase enriched uranium and recruit qualified personnel abroad, but that didn't go very well. Smuggling weapons-grade uranium isn't like smuggling oil. We're talking about a sector with very few producers, relatively few users, and very tight monitoring by international agencies. In other words, it's extremely difficult to move this uranium from one country to another without raising suspicions. So, Iran was forced to enrich its own uranium, and at that point, they didn't even know how to convert the gaseous uranium coming out of the centrifuges into metal. That's when Iran really got serious about building the underground laboratories and centrifuge plants we're all familiar with today. According to Israeli intelligence, the Al-Gadir plant was designed to produce enough enriched uranium to build 3 nuclear bombs every 2 years. As for foreign scientists, well, Iran received significant help from Pakistan, and some ex-Soviet scientists played a crucial role in the early years of the Ahmad Plan. But in reality, not many participated directly in the project. This forced Iran to train its own workforce, which, on one hand, delayed the project, but on the other hand, allowed the Ayatollah regime to develop a new generation of experts who are now fully capable of building a nuclear bomb on their own, and that's a very important point. And I know what many of you are probably wondering. If the Ahmad Plan estimated that the nuclear bomb would be ready by 2004, how is it possible that here we are in 2025 and Iran still hasn't built one? Well, the thing is, this plan faced constant delays until it was finally cancelled in 2003. Although cancelled should definitely be in quotation marks. But let's break it down step by step. You see, among the thousands of documents the Mossad seized during the operation we mentioned earlier, there was an organizational chart with over 630 separate tasks, and almost all of them were behind schedule. For example, between late 2001 and early 2002, the pilot plant for installing the uranium centrifuges was supposed to be 38% complete, but it had only reached 4%. Likewise, the industrial model of the centrifuges was supposed to be fully completed, but was only around 70% done. Overall, by 2002, the Ahmad Plan was about 40% complete, which, hey, wasn't nothing, but it was still a long way from their initial goal. Why? Well, the lack of specialized manpower was certainly one factor, and of course, working in underground labs hidden from the world's eyes is no easy task. But the main bottleneck was coordination.
In the current structure, each sub-project is an independent island in relation to other sub-projects. Despite the fact that there have been meetings of the Test and Follow-up Council, and various tests were executed over the past few months, due to the lack of coordination and managerial cohesion, we haven't had significant progress.
Think about it. The various Iranian groups could not just communicate by, I don't know, sending each other WhatsApp messages. Israel would figure that out pretty quickly. In fact, another reason for the constant delays has been the assassinations that Israel has repeatedly carried out against key figures in Iran's nuclear program. However, the network is so decentralized that these operations don't don't seem to be as effective as they might appear. One gets eliminated, and another simply moves up to take their place. But going back to the communication problems, in practice, each group operated like an independent cell. This meant that each individual project advanced at a decent pace, yes, but when the time came to combine the different sub-projects, the result was an absolute mess. Iran made significant progress developing a neutron detonator, converting gaseous uranium into metal, and running computer simulations of missile flight paths, but it never managed to build an integrated production chain. In any case, these problems would only have delayed the Iranian nuclear program by a few years. In 2003, however, something changed everything. Without warning, and apparently voluntarily, the government ordered a halt to the construction of the atomic bomb. Several underground laboratories were shut down, and others were put to civilian use. The question, of course, is why? Why did the Iranian leadership order the halt of a nuclear program that wasn't actually doing that badly? The truth is, we don't really know. But let's recall the context to 2003. A year earlier, George Bush had already included Iran in the so-called Axis of Evil, and although the world still didn't know the full extent of Iran's nuclear program, there were already suspicions about the Natanz facility, which, by the way, was one of the targets in the recent American strike. A year later, the US invaded Iraq looking for weapons of mass destruction. True, those weapons never turned up, but now, put yourself in the shoes of the Ayatollahs. If Uncle Sam had invaded Iraq, why wouldn't he do the same with Iran? Sure, the Iraq fiasco ended up being so humiliating for the US that it likely discouraged them from invading anyone for quite a while, but that only became clear in hindsight. And on top of that, it could have easily gone the other way. If US intelligence had confirmed the suspicions they already had about Project Ahmad, then invading Iran could have become a form of redemption. See, the Axis of Evil was building weapons of mass destruction after all. We weren't so far off. But hold on a second. What if there was another explanation? One that's even simpler. That Supreme Leader Khamenei himself was opposed to nuclear weapons. And we're not just saying this randomly. Pay attention to this speech he gave, which is posted on his official website, khamenei.ir.
We are not after nuclear weapons, and this is not because they are telling us not to pursue these things. Rather, we do not want these things for the sake of ourselves and our religion, and because reason is telling us not to do so.
Remember how Iraq attacked Iran with chemical weapons during the 8-year war? Well, there are people who argue that this left such a deep trauma on the Iranian people, seeing the horror of those weapons, that they vowed never to use something so deadly. This could be seen in several of the Ayatollah's speeches, most notably in his fatwa against nuclear weapons. A fatwa is something like an order from a religious authority, in this case, from the highest authority. And don't forget that the Ayatollah is not only the supreme leader of Iran, he is also the leader of all Shiite Islam. According to this fatwa, nuclear weapons are haram and against Sharia, both to use them and, keep this in mind, the mere fact of possessing them. So the question is Iran's supreme leader really against Iran's nuclear program? Obviously, there are very few people in the West who believe this. To begin with, the Ayatollah himself has said in public that Libya made a very serious mistake in handing over its nuclear arsenal, but the Supreme Leader has also made it clear that if circumstances change, then the fatwa could change as well. In other words, if Iran feels it is in danger, it might not hesitate to use nuclear weapons, or at least in developing them for use as a diplomatic shield. And let's keep one thing in mind. In 2003, the Ahmad plan came to an end. That's true, but this did not imply the end of the Iranian nuclear program.
The report found that, although Tehran's organized nuclear weapons program ended in 2003, some activities continued through 2009. According to the assessment, the activities did not advance beyond feasibility and scientific studies and the acquisition of certain relevant technical competencies and capabilities.
During these years, the Iranian regime didn't slow down, quite the opposite. It took the opportunity to better train the workers involved in the nuclear program and to advance in the more theoretical aspects, such as computer simulations. What's more, it's increasingly blurred the lines between civilian and military uses. This way, the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization enriched uranium up to 4%, the threshold for civilian use, while simultaneously acquiring the technology and expertise needed to enrich it further if necessary. But that wasn't all. Iran also built additional underground centrifuge plants, like the one at Fordow, which was also targeted by the US just a few days ago. This facility was operated by the Ministry of Defense, which maintained close ties with the Atomic Energy Organization. In fact, it's believed that much of the uranium enriched to about 4% eventually ended up at some secret facility controlled by the Ministry of Defense to further be enriched. Overall, the Ayatollah regime's strategy during this period was to advance much more slowly, but to lay the groundwork so that if one day the decision was made, the nuclear program could be completed at record speed. Technically, Iran isn't building a nuclear bomb. It's simply advancing on every single front necessary to build one. Of course, everything comes under the banner of civilian applications. For us, nuclear weapons are haram, they claim. The problem for Iran is that the international community just didn't buy it, especially once these underground plants started to be exposed. In the end, under growing international pressure, Iran caved and in 2015 signed the Vienna Agreement. In exchange, the West agreed to lift many of the sanctions that had prevented Iran from exporting oil, and also unfroze $100 billion worth of assets. For its part, Iran committed to stop enriching uranium above 3.67%, and even forced a cap on the total amount of uranium it could enrich for civilian purposes. There were, of course, many other restrictions, including blocking Iran's access to next-generation centrifuges. Now, what many people don't realize is that most of these restrictions came with expiration dates. For example, in 2026, the limit on the amount of uranium Iran could enrich for civilian use would have increased. And I say would have because, in reality, it no longer matters. In 2018, Donald Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal, claiming that Iran wasn't complying with it. Now, he wasn't entirely wrong, but one thing is clear. Since then, Iran has slammed the accelerator on its nuclear program.
Iran's stockpile of 60% enriched uranium had grown from 274.8 kilograms in early February to 408.6 kilograms. This is enough fuel for 9 warheads.
To put this figure in context, it took Iran only 1 year to rebuild the stockpile of uranium lost after the 2015 deal, implying that the nuclear program was never completely abandoned. It was simply warming up on the bench until the coach gave it the order to take to the field. But it doesn't end there. The nuclear agreement limited enriched uranium, whatever its percentage, to a maximum of 200 kilos. Now, let me ask you, how much enriched uranium does Iran have? 150 kilos? 400? Well, no. Cold. The regime of the Ayatollahs has accumulated 9 tons of uranium, about 40 times more than what is allowed. True, much of this uranium is only enriched to 3.67%, but remember what we told you before. Since the end of the Ahmad Plan, Iran has specialized in enriching uranium for civilian use on one hand, and it takes to an underground plant to enrich it further while no one is looking. However, this is not even the most important thing. With the 400 kilos of 60% enriched uranium Iran already has in its possession, and which nobody knows the location of after the US bombing, the Persians could get enough material to make 9 to 10 nuclear missiles in just a few months. All thanks to the more than 16,000 centrifuges it has, including 6 cascades of 6th generation centrifuges at the Fordow plant, centrifuges that Iran was completely forbidden to acquire. One of the advantages of these centrifuges is that they can operate in much smaller spaces. For example, the IR-2 centrifuges centrifuge the same uranium as the IR-1 centrifuges, using only 1/5 of the space. This is very attractive for the uranium nuclear program, since there may be uranium enrichment plants that we don't even know about because they are so small and hidden so deep. But it's news like this that is the most disturbing.
March 1st, 2023. Iran nuclear. IAEA inspectors find uranium particles enriched to 83.7%.
By 2023, the Iranians already had enough technology to move from 60% enriched uranium, which they achieved in April 2021, to enrichments above 80%. This means that the Ayatollahs can almost certainly make weapons-grade uranium. Of course, Iran has said that those particles detected by the International Atomic Energy Organization are an accident, a mistake that anyone could make, that they did it unintentionally, although they have also said that other countries have left those particles there to incriminate the poor Iranians and friends. That's how it's been across the board. Iran has never been particularly cooperative with the IAEA, the agency responsible for monitoring compliance with nuclear agreements, but since 2018, things have been getting worse. Inspectors' access has been limited to plants plants they were previously allowed to visit. And while cameras have been installed at some of these plants, Iran is not sharing the recordings. This is precisely why the IAEA has never stated that there is concrete evidence of Iran actively developing a nuclear bomb. That's true, there's no direct proof. But if it walks like a duck, has a bill like a duck, and quacks like a duck, then chances are it's pretty good it's a duck. That's the message the agency has always tried to subtly convey.
The agency has no credible indications of an ongoing, undeclared structured nuclear program. However, repeated statements by former high-level officials in Iran related to Iran having all capabilities to manufacture nuclear weapons continue to provide concerns in this area.
Given all this context, we can finally try to answer the crucial question of this video. How close was Iran to getting the nuclear bomb? Or better said, if Ayatollah Khamenei were to give the order, how long would it take Iran to pull together all the progress it has made and actually build a weapon of mass destruction? Well, the biggest obstacle in building a nuclear bomb is enriching uranium, but we've already seen that the Iranians don't have much trouble on that front. They already have uranium enriched to 60%, enough to make 9 or 10 missiles if they pushed it to 90%, and most experts believe they would need just 3 weeks or a few months to get there. The next step is turning the gaseous uranium into metal. On this point, we know Iran already has the technology and know-how. This wouldn't slow them down, at least if their equipment wasn't destroyed by the Israeli bombings. They'd also need to build a neutron detonator, but that milestone was already reached during the Ahmad plan. So again, not much of a hurdle here. The big question is the missile. It's pretty clear that for 2 decades, Iran has wanted to mount a nuclear warhead on a Shahab-3, a ballistic missile with a range of 1,300 to 2,000 kilometers based on North Korean technology. But there are 2 major technical challenges: miniaturizing the nuclear weapon to fit inside the missile and building a reliable re-entry vehicle. We know that Iran has made considerable progress on this since the end of the Ahmad plan in 2003, but no one really knows how far along they are. Truth be told, considering their progress in other areas, it's hard to believe they're very far behind here. However, this part of the process does involve a lot of trial and error, and Iran doesn't have much room to run nuclear tests without the entire world noticing. In short, Iran has been moving forward on all the fronts necessary to someday slam its foot on the gas and complete the bomb. If that day ever comes, they could have weapons-grade uranium within weeks, and likely need less than a year to turn it into a fully functional missile. Of course, all this analysis is based on data from before the Israeli and US strikes. Right now, nobody knows the exact state of Iran's nuclear program. But keep one thing in mind. Until now, Iran was protected by a proxy war shield that kept much of the region distracted. We are referring to, of course, about Hamas and Hezbollah, 2 groups that are both on the ropes today. If we add the recent attacks on its nuclear program, even with a ceasefire, it's very possible that the Ayatollah may decide it's time to ignore that fatwa banning nuclear weapons. In other words, despite everything we've seen, Iran still has the technology and knowledge and might finally decide to step on the accelerator. In any case, now it's your turn. Do you think Iran was already on track to get the atomic bomb before the June 13th attacks? Was it really that close to its nuclear dream? Or were there still some hidden bottlenecks we haven't considered? And after the US bombings, is Iran now closer or further away from going nuclear? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments, and let's open up the debate. And of course, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't done so yet. As always, thank you so much for being there. Take care. I will see you next time.